Hi, I'm Jesse Hirsh, and welcome to another episode of Metaviews, recorded live in front of the Academy of the Impossible, where today the goats are having a bit of a rainy day, but I've been taking them for a run. I probably will again later. The title loosely for today is Corporate Politics, and that's not meant to be literal in the sense of the politics of corporations, but more cultural, that all politics tends to be corporate now. We are kind of in the tail end of season 2 here on Metaviews, and that means we are embracing our spontaneous conversation even more so. But unlike previous guests, Russell has already been participating quite extensively. And Russell, even though I don't respond to all of your comments, in the comments, you will, I hope, notice that I respond to them in the podcast, that they have a huge influence on our perspective, our topics. In fact, we've got this big season finale coming up on ontologies. And the plural is very much thanks to your reminder. Although I will, in my own way, sort of say that I was coming to it with the plural implicit. But I think you were correct to note that if we just used ontology as a single, people might assume that there is only one ontology when there absolutely isn't. I think the plural is a much more honest and direct approach. But of course, we start every episode of Metaviews with the news. And today, today the Metaviews issue is a little bit of what's the word I want to use here? It's a little bit of a throwaway, and it's a throwaway not in the sense that I'm discarding the issue, but rule by trolling really seems like a basic concept. Most of the Metaviews issues, I really try to get to a higher level of thinking, a higher level of complexity, and I was kind of just lazy in writing about the rule by trolling because it doesn't actually seem like quite an insightful idea. But it was just an idea. Well, I kind of do my Substack as a form of therapy where I'm sharing what's on my head and writing it so that it gets out of my head and I can think about new ideas. But Russell, as you know, our news segment really is about our guest. And it's about throwing to our guest and saying, hey, what news do you have for the Metaviews network? Now that you are here finally on our show, we'd love to hear what you're paying attention to in the broader informational landscape.
Well, watching your blog and podcasts, I've noticed that we watch very similar things. And I actually read your article this morning. I wouldn't call it throwaway. I actually wanted to riff off of the video you threw at the end talking about COVID.
Thank you.
And long COVID, and in my case, Lyme disease and autism, and the video sort of ends talking about U.S. politics and eugenics.
Yes.
And how frightening. One of the things, if we go back 100 years, people like to forget that there was more than just one group that was being sent to camps. And actually, before it was political dissidents and before it was religious groups, it was disabled people. And I'm someone who only recently came to understand my own connection with that word. I'm autistic. I don't think of that as a disability, but the medical profession and the government sure does. And United States has someone who thinks autism comes from vaccines and wants to have us all registered. And one of the efficiencies of 100 years ago, because genocide applies to many things, not just efficient murder. But if we want to talk about the efficient part, lists of people who are othered is extremely dangerous. I mean, the Shoah became so huge because there was a community that was proud of themselves, that had lists. And yes, there were other people that didn't like the people on that list, but there were lists, and those lists were used for efficiency. So yes, when I watch politics, I'm watching it not about some individual being a troll, but systems and patterns and history rhyming.
Well, and I'm really glad that you caught on that video that I threw at the end, because there's often, it appears as if there's a randomness to the TikToks. And I used to alternate between TikToks and YouTubes. And I'll, for example, include this video at the end of tomorrow's episode. But I often do it as a weird association of meaning. And today it was very deliberate, because, you know, the subject of COVID and long COVID is very dear to my heart, partly because I have long COVID. I'm struggling with long COVID. My cognitive capabilities are significantly diminished. But also, to your point, it ties into disability. It ties into disability justice. I will be writing about eugenics in the near future, because to your point, it is a terror that is reemerging. And it is a logic that underpins contemporary politics globally, not just in the rise of authoritarianism, but I think within liberalism as well. There is a rash of eugenics. But at the same time, you mentioned another thread that I want to get at, which is shout out to IBM and the role that they played in the Holocaust. Because what's important that we remember that. And it's not just because Palantir seems to be playing a similar role today, in addition to other technological companies. But on a personal level, I in the past year, recently registered for the federal disability tax credit. And it was a conflicting decision, because on the one hand, I've always avoided official designation, right? I didn't want to ever be on the list. I'm Jewish, so I kind of figured that they'd get me for that. But my parents, you know, always encouraged me to avoid any diagnosis, even though they were health professionals, because they understand the stigmatization, the kind of double-edged sword that it comes with. Now, granted, I'm broke, so I need the money from the disability tax credit. And where I did not use my self-identified autism to get my disability, I instead have a couple of gastrointestinal issues that when I went through my family doctor and we filled out the disability forms, and then when I got it back, here's the paradox that did have a psychological impact on me. Now, according to the federal government, I have been disabled since 1986. So the idea that I have been experiencing disability since 1986 is not something that I've understood until COVID. Because it was COVID and the experience of politicization of disability that allowed me to recognize that I had internalized ableism. That even though I was disabled all this time, I didn't see myself as disabled, right? Because of the way in which society marginalizes and, you know, gaslights and does all the things to tell you, no, you're not disabled. You're just having a hard time, right? Or, you know, what? And so it was, on the one hand, I don't like that I'm now part of that registry. But on the other hand, I feel liberated. Right? Like I feel a little validated that I have been disabled since 1986. I have lived my entire life compensating and dealing with this disability in a way that I need to be more open of. And I need to be more assertive about my needs, especially gastrointestinal, because it's everything from needing access to a bathroom to, you know, I don't eat at restaurants, haven't eaten at restaurants, because trying to get servers to deal with my needs is near impossible. But this is why, amidst the rise of eugenics, which fucking terrifies me, I am finding a certain hope that there is a disability justice movement gaining steam, and it is helping people like us to, you know, I don't like the word pride, but get a sense of who we are and what our needs are and what role we can play in the resistance moving forward. Final thoughts before we go on to the future segment.
Oh, sorry. I was actually going to I wanted to ask you about 1986, but I'll do a little bit of my story and then go back. So I was told around 2000 to look into autism. There was a lot of autism in the tech community. I'm in the tech community. Um, when I looked, I saw a list of deficits. The deficits didn't seem to apply to me as far as I could tell. And so I dismissed it. Um, I now look at how much I could have done better if I had known myself better, because I've got myself into a lot of interesting situations. But I grew up with an idea. I was constantly told about human nature and how we're all the same and we think and our motivations are the same. And and I regularly think, okay, so am I an alien then? Because I don't seem to, this human nature thing doesn't seem to apply to me. I mean, right from a child, I always thought of myself as Spock. That's the character I identified most with. I have a human side, this this weird emotional thing that makes no sense, and then I have the logic side. And I'd notice all these people walking around fully human, fully emotional, completely irrational as far as I could tell, with completely weird ideas. Like, my own wife sometimes can't tell if I'm excited because I'm talking about one of my special interests or I'm angry. So people would see me, see this weird world, and it's like, well, where'd that come from? So 2000, I rejected it could be autistic, even though there were signs right from birth. But it's a defect. It's a defect. Um, I actually went through anti-racism learning and intersectionality and learning about that whole area, which is all just systems theory,
Yes,
which,
yes,
as a systems guy, I should have got it, but didn't because, human nature. Um, and then when I got Lyme disease and long COVID, like it's interesting how the funding goes. Some countries can't study COVID because of political reasons, so they study Lyme disease, and and it's essentially, the
yeah,
money is it's the same essential thing that they're studying.
yeah. Kind of
So I got
post viral immune issues.
issues, and so I didn't have energy to mask. Was proved that I had a mask because I was, of course, a skeptic that I'm a terrible actor, so how can I possibly have a mask? And then accepted it. But then once I accepted it, I realized, um, I'm in my 50s, and I'm extremely privileged as an autistic person to have had a job. I'm married. I'm like, all of these things that, of course, we were recently told we would never be able to do by a certain US figure. Um, but now I feel like it's my duty as one of the privileged people to be out,
Yeah,
to try to make it safer for those for intersectionality reasons. I mean, you could see me, I'm a very large white male looking, we can get into gender later if we want. But I have a privilege that other people don't have. So I outed myself. And I do think the word pride is helpful, because pride is people getting together and feeling like they belong. Like, I actually went to Pride this year. I didn't before because I thought, well, what does this have to do with me? Well, I have a invisible difference.
mm-hmm.
If I keep my mouth shut, I look like just like everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very similar to gender diversity, sexual orientation diversity, and now neurodiversity.
Mm-hmm.
So I
Mm-hmm.
now see the value of pride, the value of those of us who can semi-safely come out to do so, and to help protect those who can't.
And while I do acknowledge you have a question, which I'll let you ask before we close off this segment, I do want to quickly point out when I said pride, I didn't mean the political concept. I more meant the word. And I say this because, as I think you know, I live in Lanark County, which is pretty darn right wing. And we live on a major county road, and we fly a trans pride flag, right? Primarily because we are intersectional, we are proud, we are queer, essentially. I identify with that word. But the concept of pride compared to humility is something I wrestle with. And that's all I meant by that. And we can explore that at some future date. But, you know, you wanted to ask a question about 1986 before we segue to the future.
You marked that. I know we're about the same age, so it's not like, you know, you were from birth. So what happened in 1986?
It was a medical incident. And to sort of riff off what you were saying, part of my privilege, beyond just my externally visible identity, was my parents were weird, like freaks. And they raised me to believe that I am unique and that is wonderful. So that's a huge privilege. And I always recognized that was a huge privilege. And so when in 1986, and I only use that because that's what the government recognizes. Like I don't remember time, but the government does. But what the incident that happened then was my esophagus failed. And it failed in the sense that if I was alive 50 years earlier, that would have been my death. Because it would have prevented me from eating. It would have prevented me from drinking. And what they did, the medical procedure then, and I think I still fucking kind of do it now, in some cases is called the pneumatic dilatation, where they put a huge tube down your throat with the balloon at the end, and they pump it up, and they rip your sphincter, which is the muscle between your esophagus and your stomach. So with normal people, when you swallow, the sphincter opens to let the food in and then closes to prevent the acid out. So mine just closed permanently. And so they had to permanently rip it open so it remained open. And then I had to have a few more procedures over the years dealing with that. But that meant literally that my esophagus is disabled. But I never saw it that way. I just saw, and what was weird is they did a lot of medical tests, invasive medical tests, traumatic medical tests. And in all of them, they kept telling me, man, you're really unique. Like nobody has what you have. Like what you've got is really, so to me, I wasn't disabled. I was unique. I already knew that. I grew up my entire life that way. Oh yeah, man, I'm not like everybody else. I'm just different. Right? So again, it was skewed within my own radical view of the world, and it never occurred to me that I was disabled, even though literally that's what it is. Right? And the rest of my life, I had to accommodate for the fact that I don't have a working esophagus and yada, 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 blah, 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 blah. But that's only one aspect of my disability. Like there are other aspects too, but I think to go to your question on a narrative level, that was the ableist within there. That was an ableist narrative in which I was like, I'm not disabled, I'm unique, without realizing that everyone's unique and everyone's kind of disabled. But we digress. That's the past. We got to get to the future. Part of the purpose of having these segments is to make sure there's some structure to the spontaneous conversations we have. And as you know, WTF, what's the future? Partly because we want to maintain a future-centric view when it comes to our podcast. Partly, to go to your point about eugenics, futurism is kind of fascist. Like it came out of Italian fascism, and American futurism today still seems to be fueling the eugenics and authoritarianism that is rising with the Trump regime. So in making futurism part of our repertoire here, we are trying to reclaim it from the enemies, the class enemies that we currently face. But with that little political explanation aside, Russell, what do you got? What do you see on the event horizon that you could offer the Metaviews crew?
I don't know if I have a specific thing on the event horizon, but more. So even when I watch the news, I think I watch it differently than the average viewer. They're looking to try to figure out what's happening now, whereas I'm trying to fit what's happening into patterns and see where there can be improvements for bad patterns and that type of thing. So long before I had done any studying on Indigenous peoples of this continent, I knew about the seven generation concept. And essentially that you think in terms of, yes, you think seven generations into the past and see who you are, like your position, based not on business quarters or years or the next election or silly concepts like that, but seven generations. I am who I am because of things that has happened for seven generations. And seven generations ago, you know, some of my ancestors were on this continent, New France, that type of thing. But most of my ancestors are more recent. But I'm considered Canadian because I was born on this continent. My parents were born on this continent. My grandparents were born on the continent. But my great grandparents and that type of thing were not. And there's beliefs that came to me through my ancestors, not through DNA or that type of thing, but just by what groups I'm going to be around, who they're going to introduce me, all that type of thing. But then where does that lead to future wise? And to think everything that I'm doing now is then going to impact seven generations in the future. And also separate the idea that it has to be my children.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like I have impact on future generations, whether I and my wife have children or not. My
Well,
wife's a high school teacher. She
and
has a lot of impact in the next generation.
I was gonna say, and for the record, this is why I'm podcasting, because
Yes,
I think this is potentially one of the best ways to do that. Please continue.
yes. And so I think not in terms of the next quarter forward or the previous quarter, but what are we doing now that can better the future? Um, and so yes, we're probably going to get into the whole corporate siloed hierarchies. Um, but part of learning about the seven generations and learning the origins of the seven generations is learning other worldviews, which gets into the S and the ontologies and all that type of thing. I mean, I wish people, rather than thinking that there's a ontology to think of humanity, to recognize that there's translations between ontologies, that there is completely different ideas that we can look towards, and the thinking that is more indigenous to this continent. And remember that there's a lot of nations on this continent. For people to sit there and say, look at Europe, it's all one thing, right? There's never been a disagreement between groups of Europeans, right? There is clearly no disagreements going on in Europe, say right now. There's never been violence between Europeans disagreeing. So there's diversity in Europe. Of course, there's diversity on this continent, um, but there's some things that have been common. And rather than an ethic of interference, there's an ethic of non-interference here. Treaties and borders treaties are not about fixed lines in the sand. They're about how do people get along in that area where there's overlap. So you have a concentration of one group here, a concentration of one group here. Fine, that's their communities. The treaties are about this part, the part where there's overlap. And so rather than drawing straight lines and saying, well, if you cross over this line, da 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 da, so there's completely different ways of looking at things. And rather than trying to convert everybody to your way of thinking, to recognize like this non-interference. I have my beliefs, you have your beliefs. As long as your belief is that you have to kill me, we're fine.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's completely different ways of looking. To me, the future is partly to reevaluate certain pasts and to put some of those pasts into the past. Like
Mm-hmm.
I'm quite frustrated about how loyalists to Western worldviews like to put Indigenous people into the past. So, oh, that's the past. Just go over it. Well, why is it that past that has to be gotten over with,
Well,
as opposed to the hey, this continent isn't Europe. why does it have to be governed based on European history?
But I think there's a paradox to what you're saying, because I think the Western worldview is now in the past. And I think in their intuition, they know that. I think Jordan Peterson, to a large extent, is a great example of his own subconscious overwhelming him to the extent that he's, on the one hand, become incoherent, but on the other hand, become a poster boy for the fall of Western civilization, because he cannot come to terms. He knows it's falling. All of his language is him raising the alarm about the decline of Western civilization. It comes, as any Western thinker would, in the form of violence as an attempt to assert the superiority of Western civilization. But his actual narrative, if you listen to it as I would, is he is accurately describing the fall of Western civilization in past tense, in the sense that it has already fallen. Now, unfortunately, like, how many hundreds of years did it take Rome to fall? And you include I'm not saying it's not going to be pretty, or that it's going to be pretty, quite the contrary. But I think the West is in the past. And that's exactly why they're trying to put everything else in the past, because they feel, now that is a paradox, and we are thankfully in our future segment. So this is where we don't have to be definitive. We are just describing concepts. And I think your point about 7 generations is valid, because I think separate from this, and I'm not opening this up, I'm just flagging this as a potential future Metaviews. What would the 7-generation approach to AI be? Because I think that would be an interesting puzzle or paradox to play with that, again, speaks to how, to your fundamental criticism, and this is going to allow me to segue into our future segment, we are stuck in a corporate culture that thinks quarterly, at best. I don't even think they think annually. I think they think weekly at this point, and that we need to discard that culture and come to something larger. But before we go to the point of discarding, you have been making a very consistent and, I believe, coherent argument that contemporary politics is entirely corporatized, and that as a consequence is inherently authoritarian. And I find that to be a very self-evident argument, but I suspect the vast majority of people do not, and either respond to you with verbal violence or respond to you with complete incoherence and confusion. So I don't want you to get into the depth of the argument, partly because I feel it's kind of self-evident, but I want you to present the argument in a manner that reflects the reactions you've gotten and how that makes you, as a pattern recognition person, how you see this struggle, because I think you and I share this struggle, to discard the corporatization of politics as well as the larger corporate culture that dominates North American thinking.
I'm having a hard time separating the last segment and this segment.
There was no separation. I was just trying to mark a moment. Yes, please continue.
Movement and graphics. Because I do think there's a fair bit of that top-down thinking that comes from the history of Europe, which is not universal. Feudalism moving into democracy, but not entirely moving into democracy, because so I could give a little bit of my own little political history, and then I'll bring it back into why I think we have some bigger issues in democratic institutions than just how we elect our members of parliament. So I was a partisan in the 1990s. I was heavily involved in the Green Party. And at that time, I bought into the...
And also, I think for people who are not familiar with you, because I almost brought this up when you were talking about your privilege, I think another privilege that is worth disclosing at this moment is that you live in Ottawa.
Yes.
Right? That you live in the federal capital. Because Ottawa is, as someone who spent most of his life in Toronto, Ottawa is a very unique Canadian city, especially if you live within access to Parliament Hill, because you are able to attend and participate in politics in a manner that is not accessible anywhere else in the country. Please,
Well,
with that caveat aside.
well, with that caveat, but I want to expand that caveat though, which is that um, that is true of the federal government, but of course in Toronto you had direct access to the provincial government.
No, I want to push
No,
back.
okay, go ahead.
Not really, because the provincial government does not operate at the same level of accessibility and without the same critical mass as the federal government, in the sense that a lot of people from across the country go to Ottawa to engage the federal government as NGOs, as corporate lobbyists, as staff to MPs. The same doesn't really exist in Toronto. Toronto is much more of a commercial center rather than a political center. And there have been so many times where I've been in policy events in Ottawa going, why the fuck does this not happen in Toronto? And when I tried to organize it in Toronto, the conversation goes back to the fucking marketplace. It goes back to like all these, like the culture in Toronto is too dominant in terms of the center of capitalism and the center of corporations, that it just doesn't have the same political culture. You are correct that if you are a wonk, you can get involved in provincial politics in Toronto, but you can do that in North Bay. Like, it's just not the same. The village that exists on Parliament Hill is a unique kind of insular culture that is not the same as the insular culture in Queen's Park, because the insular culture in Toronto is Bay Street. And Bay Street tends to be, so again, we're nitpicking.
Okay,
But
okay,
please go back to your original
okay,
point.
Go back.
These digressions are what make Metaviews Metaviews. Please continue.
Except I was listening and not putting notes to remember where we digressed from.
That's the point of the spontaneous conversation. It goes where it goes, Russell.
Yes, I understand. So yes, one of my privileges is in Ottawa, but when I came to Ottawa, it was for a university and the high tech sector, and this was Silicon Valley North, and let's avoid talking about why that died for certain reasons. So I was partisan in the 1990s, involved in the Green Party, and at the time, I bought into what had become the political culture in most Western democracies, which is you build your group of people that are like-minded, and then you fight with everyone else to try to get your point of view into legislation, into policy. Um, and and so I bought into that whole idea that it's all about the political parties. You have to maximize your people versus their people, and that whole culture.
And just to push back, I think like-minded is correct, but I think it's an understatement, because I think there's a certain level of I don't want to say solidarity, because that's not the right word. Homogeneity is closer.
Yeah.
But this feeds your argument of the corporate culture. Please continue.
Yes, exactly. So I bought into that, and so for instance, if I'm just going to mention electoral reform just as a tiny piece, because I don't believe it can be thought of in isolation. But at that time, because it was all about getting as many of our people into the room as possible, I really bought into proportional representation and making sure, and proportional representation based on parties. So people support their party, and then their party gets in. And then in the 2000s, I started to actually go to committees and started to actually speak with members of parliament, candidates, and across the political spectrum. And the more time I spent there, the more I looked at parliament not as a place that should be a negotiation between warring special interest groups, but as a workplace where democracy should be happening. So it's
Where
parliament where democracy.
conversations should be happening.
But there's people that are sent there to represent us, and in all of our intersectionality, all our complexities, and not what I've come to see as a sport,
Yeah.
where it doesn't matter how well people are playing. It only matters which team jersey they're wearing and whether they win.
Yeah.
And it's like, and what that's a toxic workplace.
In part,
And
because to go to my point, not only is there no conversations in the parliament, there's no conversations in the locker room, the team room, right? There's no conversations in sports. Like you don't sit there on the bench and say, hey, what do you think of love? No, it's do.
no,
There's no thinking. It's
do.
just do.
And if, and unfortunately it's an if there's any thinking happening at all, it's happening in back rooms somewhere else.
It's elites
So
only.
the leaders'
Yeah.
offices have essentially taken over, and each of the, so it's not just the PMO, the Prime Minister's office, or the OLO, which is the official leader's office. It's all the leaders' offices,
Yeah.
and those essentially backroom people that are deciding what's happening. And
I would just point out that is still an ideal scenario. Because in many cases, they are not deciding what's happening. They are not thinking. They are just playing sports. And
yes,
there is no thought happening whatsoever. Please,
that's why I started
continue.
with if.
Yeah.
That's why I started with if there's any thinking, as opposed to, you know, trying to think of problem solving. And I'm huge on problem solving. It all becomes about winning. It doesn't even matter what you're winning, as long as I'm winning. And of course, the way in a lot of these rather aggressive sports is that you win is by you cause the other person to lose or the other team to lose. So so the ability of essentially we citizens are hiring people to go to a workplace to do a job, but the corporate culture of the workplace and of the management teams, because they're all wearing their team jerseys and all of that, and they're not working towards the same goal. They're working on tripping each other and yelling at each other, and it's so extremely dysfunctional. And to me, it's like I was frustrated back in the Mike Harris days that there was these groups that wanted to have anti-Mike Harris groups to get rid of the Mike Harris, and it's like, well, but there's a culture here. Oh, and then now we have to get rid of this person. No, there's a culture here. So today we'll just call it Trump. But Trump is a symptom of a problem that I've been observing my entire life. There's not really anything all that special about Trump. And part of the yes Western you might be thinking about it in terms of the past, but this whole focus on essentially a feudal way of looking at things, a top-down approach type of thing, is across the board. It's not a left and right thing. Like one of the political parties I least see myself in, and I have to be careful with this because people assume it's because of policy, and it's not. It's corporate culture. The party that I least see myself in is the NDP, and I've actually been a member of the Progressive Conservative Party and the Conservative Party and the
But
Green Party, and the
it's
NDP is the most top-down controlling, even though its policy goals suggest the opposite.
but that's why it's okay to oppose the NDP on a policy position as well, because their
Yeah.
policies are a consequence of their corporate culture, and their corporate culture is fucked. I got a lot of blowback on my NDP is dead issue because there's a lot of people right now who feel that the NDP can be salvaged, that it can be redeemed. But none of them have your argument. None of them are saying the problem with the NDP is the corporate machinations. The closest who comes to that, to give him credit, is Avi Lewis. But at the same time,
I heard
I
him.
think Avi Lewis is motivated as much by family sentiment as he is individual politics. Because I would love to ask Avi, and I may invite him back on the podcast, whether he would just try a new party if it wasn't for his granddad and his dad, right? Because maybe a new party with a new cult. Anyway, we're digressing. Go ahead.
Except that unless we change the culture of Parliament,
Right, which I think is a larger issue.
Laws.
Sorry, go ahead.
These are traditions and not even laws. Like it's not a requirement of a political party, for instance. So before the Liberal Party of Canada decided a little over a century ago that, hey, I love the United States, let's become more like the United States. I know with all elbows up, we're supposedly, anti-US, but no. Liberal Party of Canada adopted the US presidential style of having leadership conventions to decide the leader. And that's seen as that's more democratic. But not in a Westminster parliamentary system where the branches of government, and yes, we do have to talk about these systems things, not just people's emotions, but the way that the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judiciary, part of how they keep each other in check is that the executive branch exists decided by the legislative branch. So in other words, the elected members of the caucus need to decide their own leadership. And then based on the members of parliament, they go to the governor general and say, well, here's the leader that we think is going to be able to hold parliament together as a whole, not the plurality of the seats, not the this, not the that, as various groups keep pushing, but parliamentarians decide who their leadership is, and parliamentarians decide which one of those becomes the leader for the purposes of the executive branch, and then that person decides amongst the legislative branch, which is of course both the House and the Senate.
You're kind of losing me here, so bring me back to your point.
Okay. Deciding the leaders outside of Parliament, essentially within a corporation that has all of its corporate culture flaws, with essentially political tourists. They can call them members, but I've been a member of a variety of parties over my life, and that doesn't even mean I'm going to vote for that party at the next election. So you have some random sampling of people easily gained to get someone who non-parliamentarians, people outside the House of Commons, want to become the leader, and then that external manager comes in and says to the elected parliamentarians that we hired, here's what you're going to do.
So
and that's you're toxic right from the beginning.
You're losing my attention only because you're making a point we already agree on. I think detailing how the system works is something that I'm not certain is worth our time. But please, you're going somewhere with this.
Except that unless we, maybe you recognize what the problems are, but pretty much all the pushback that I've had is from people who don't recognize what the problems are.
And I'm not sure that they will. And I'm not sure they will. So that's why my original question, because you're right to bring us back, that's why I was triggering it. Because I want to get to the idea that I'm not sure we're framing the problem in a manner that allows it to be addressed. I think the core of the argument is solid. The corporate culture is an anti-democratic obstacle to many of the concepts and beliefs that people have. And you evoked this historical analogy that I want to crystallize, that you can either discard or run with, which is the feudal system never really ended. And what we had instead is the myth of democracy. And we created a culture that is not actually democratic, but has the appearances of democracy. And that's what we've been using for our government up to this point. And what I see, and I hate to use this framing, but I will only for the purpose of this conversation. What I see as an opportunity in Trump is how he discards convention. How a lot, because your point about how the Liberal Party does things, how political parties do things, they could do things differently. And it's really only culture that prevents them from doing things differently. And that's partly what Trump is doing, is he's just saying, hey, all these democratic structures, they're just conventions. I'm going to discard them and just be a naked authoritarian. Could that go the other way? Could some of these conventions be discarded to reinvigorate some democratic structure or culture into this corporate milieu that we find ourselves in? And feel free to take this in a different direction based on the many opportunities I've offered.
So part of again, I'm a systems person. I want to see, I don't think people just being emotional and saying, yeah, that clearly didn't work, is going to get us somewhere. We have to, I think, and maybe it's just because I think in a certain way and other people don't think that way. But I don't think we're automatically going to have any change just because someone's throwing everything up into the air. There's
Agreed.
a lot of people who are wanting to return back. And yes, certain conservatives have a different idea of what back they want to go to. I'm going to use the word lowercase c conservative,
Sure.
lowercase l liberal.
Yeah.
They each have some time in the past that they want to return to, as opposed to saying, well, hey, everything's been thrown up in the air. Rather than going back to your past, why not look at somebody else's past?
Right.
So even if we,
a lot of assumptions there, though. A lot of assumptions that are pushing us into more and more of a privileged space. Because to your other provocation, which, if you know, given how regular you listen to the show, you may recognize the minefield that you're evoking. Most people exist in the world of emotion.
Yeah.
And I think that is not mutually exclusive with the world of systems, because I think most people navigate systems emotionally. But I think, to go back to my earlier provocation, I think on the one hand, we have an opportunity that there is a great distrust of corporations, a great distrust of corporate culture. And I think there's an opportunity in articulating our current system, not as a democracy, but as a corporation, because I think a lot of people would react emotionally against the realization, and I don't think it's a stretch for them to realize that it is a corporation and not a democracy. But what they require is an alternative system. And here's the scenario. Could there be a new political party that, instead of adopting a corporate system, actually aspires to a democratic system? And can you envision such a system that can operate in a manner that allows this political party to be either popular enough that it gets members, or threatening enough that it gets attention?
So, I don't know if you have chickens as well as other animals there, but we've gotten into a chicken and egg question.
Sure. Although be careful getting into agricultural metaphors, because they are usually not accurate.
Well, okay. For instance, I know that we know the answer to the chicken and egg thing because eggs happened before chickens and other species, but whatever. Can, in the existing systems, we not be in the existing system?
Yes.
So, and the way, and to me, the answer is, I don't know. Maybe as a systems person, maybe this is my limitation. I don't think of myself as an individual. I think of myself as part of a larger group. I don't expect to have the whole of any answer.
Right.
To me, so for instance, can a different system exists. Well, obviously, even in Canada, Nunavut and Northwest Territories do
Right.
not use
And and
a
and
party system.
and I'm being modest. I'm not even
Yes.
talking legitimate. I'm not even talking successful. I'm just talking, and I just because we only got about 10 minutes left. I'm also where you and I can make a lot of advances in our conversations. We share a lot of values because I also am not sure about the individuals thing, right? That's so I am of the belief that we could, through our actions and the actions of others, co-design a system that addresses the need for governance, that addresses the need for inclusive culture, but that is an alternative to the corporate default that people across the political spectrum still, without thinking, gravitate towards.
But we exist within. So the question was, could a political party be an avenue for that? And I'm going to say no, but I'm going to give you a different story to explain why my gut feeling is no. That you can't just take one piece out of the greater society. So
Totally fair.
I was a member of like I lived in a housing cooperative for a number of years, and when I went in there, I was like, oh, so excited, a deliberate community. But there we were existing within
Yes.
society where you had people who did not think in terms of community, did not
Yeah.
think in terms of contributing. Their contribution, as far as they were concerned, was their rent, and that
Yeah.
was their contribution, and that was it. And so I was in the board of directors. I was going to conferences, but then I'd go back home and I'd say, well, there's community out there, but not in the co-op, because, like, yes, I have some friends, but I have some friends regardless of where I live. The deliberate community part really wasn't happening,
Yes.
because it's not like everybody who went there with the idea of, this is
But
a cooperative for community, and what does that mean?
But let's address that because I think
Yes.
you hit the nail on the head. And I did write an issue sort of alluding to the culture that comes around co-ops and participation. And I laud you on the one hand for your efforts, because I recognize, especially with co-ops, the ingrained culture is antithetical to what we are describing. But we got to pick somewhere. And I'm not saying it was that co-op, but maybe part of the necessity is to redesign the co-op to attract the people you are describing and to alienate the people who aren't. So they go, fuck this, I'm out of here. And I'm being crude, but at the same time, it is, to your point. I will grant you, you're right about the chicken and the egg analogy. It is a kind of, there's two sides, and they have to happen simultaneously. There is the political structure and the political culture that together manifest the system, and they all have different adjustments. So maybe you're right. Maybe political party is the wrong word. But I still am, and this is often how I respond to a lot of the comments, I don't see a mutual exclusivity here. I kind of feel that we do have to deal with the chicken and the egg simultaneously, and that's where maybe we need many minds and many hands and diverse folk to do that.
Yes, exactly. It needs diverse votes. I'm gonna see certain patterns, but I'm not gonna. Back to the Spock thing. I don't trust my emotions. I don't trust my human side, because I've made a lot of mistakes from my human side, and a lot of mistakes trying to read other humans, because I have a certain way of looking at the world, and I now finally I've received an assessment, and I have a medical piece of paper explaining why I see the world a little differently than the majority. So I'm going to see a certain thing, and is it an elephant or is it a snake?
Yeah.
Well, we need to get more people looking and
Yeah.
actually talking to get past.
Well,
But
and to
yes,
your
I
point,
don't think we can do it within the existing culture, though, because the existing culture is individualism
okay,
and not.
there's two sides there. There's two sides. On the one hand, it doesn't always have to be an elephant and a snake. It can be that and more. I think part of the trap of Western culture is this need for that singularity, is this need, and we should allow for more pluralistic, more subjective meaning. We are running out of time, and of course, this is your first of many appearances here on Metaviews, and I would encourage you to book your next appearance within. Yes, you passed within season 2. I definitely need you within season 2 to get another episode in. So if you want next Sunday, or let's say within a week or within 10 days, please book another episode, because my blood sugar is falling rapidly. So we are going to have to bring this in. But there's a few comments, a few points I still want us to flesh out. You know, I agree that there is a paradox around creating a new culture within the dominant culture. I think inevitably it has to happen. I think it is complicated. It is messy. While problematic, the closest intellectual understanding of this that I've come across is Lenin's concept of dual power, which is building the new society within the shell of the old. I'm not a fan of Leninism. John Lennon, absolutely. Vladimir Ilyich, not as much. But nonetheless, his concept of dual power, when appropriated into anti-authoritarian context, I think is very powerful. We can revisit that in a future episode. But the other thing I kind of want to touch upon and explore is the way in which, to go back to my earlier point, the West is unraveling on its own. And on the one hand, I think indigenous cultures, First Nations here across North America, have a huge amount of ideas and history and science for us to access as the West falls apart. But other cultures around the world do as well. And those cultures are now also present here in North America thanks to diasporas, right? So that's why I do think that we have access to these systems. And there are ways in which these systems can start to form in spite of the individualism that exists here in the West. Because my journey towards self-identifying as autistic has been very unique because of my point about how my parents allowed me to identify as being unique. And I'm only now, they're only now realizing that they are also neurodivergent, right? And they had their own idiosyncrasies, you know what I mean, that have allowed them to get that far. Because I think one of the reasons that I was able to get as far as I was without understanding my own autism is I'm fucking amazing at masking. Like professional class masking, right? Like that was my CBC career forever, was I knew how to put on the CBC mask. It wasn't me, but I was really good at wearing the CBC mask, so much so that CBC people were like, fuck, look at that guy. He's wearing the CBC mask so good. But to your point, it resulted in huge burnout because it's not me. I was just wearing the fucking mask. But the other side is I'm really fucking good at emotions. Like really, really good at emotions, to the extent that I'm amazing with animals because I can read their emotions. But in a way that it depends upon my masking. Because, you know, you made an earlier aside that people, your partner, can't distinguish between your excitement and your anger.
But animals can.
But I'm the same way. I'm the same way that people can't distinguish between my excitement and my anger, right? And that's where, even though I'm really good at emotions, I'm not good at presenting my emotions. So I can read other people's emotions, but I still have to use the mask, and I don't use the same mask as everybody else. And I use all of this to say, I think the fortress of individualism is falling and falling fast. And I think that the concept of individualism is the exact, to go back to my Jordan Peterson example, the fact that these motherfuckers are becoming violent is exactly my proof that they are failing, that their concept is falling, that the individual as it exists today is facing an existential crisis in which it will not recover. So I agree with you that individualism poses a very a violent opposition to the kind of political systems that we are describing. I think it is becoming less powerful with every day. And, that can be a future conversation. We can explore that and banter that. But before we segue to the shout outs, I do want to say that I really valued the comments that you've been posting to our episodes, both here on YouTube and on Substack. And it speaks, and I bring it up because it speaks to the kind of political systems that you and I are describing. Right. And I wrote a post about this a week ago or so about how the political culture today, in saying we can't read the comments, right? Like contemporary corporate culture is based upon ignoring the internet, right? The corporate machine, that is the Liberal Party, that is the Democratic Party, is based on the idea that the internet is bad, that the comments have to be ignored, and, the internet is a hostile force, and its entire corporate culture, including the NDP. I'm not trying to exclude the NDP from this. It's fucked up. And that is why, and I bury this at the end of a Metaviews episode, that is why I stopped doing the Red Tory podcast. Because Alan fundamentally shares that mentality. That the internet is hostile, that the internet should not be listened to. He even suggested, I said to him, I told to him that there was this guy on the Red Tory comments evoking Maurice Strong conspiracy theories, right? I ended up erasing him from the Red Tory comments, but I thought it was hilarious. And Alan's response was, well, just turn the comments off. And I'm like, no way! That's where the wisdom comes from. That's where the best yes, you get some shit, but you also get gold. And it is this fucking political culture that thinks that the comments are the enemy, that the comments are a problem, that the wisdom of the crowds is stupidity. And I'm becoming incoherent. I will have to articulate this again in a future episode. But that fundamentally was why I had to stop Red Tory, because I cannot have a podcast that does not embrace what we are describing, which is creating a system in which participation is rewarded, that participation from anyone, individual or otherwise, is valued. I digress, but you've got some confusion that is going to come in the form of a clarifying question.
Well, I don't know if I'm mourning what you just said. So I see what you see in Alan's
demeanor
and comments, but I follow his Substack religiously.
Yeah, he's a really smart guy, wise guy.
And no, but specifically, there's insights from his experience that he's actually willing to share that not everybody does. So
he's willing to share as a broadcaster.
But see, you're not a broadcaster. You're not gonna interact with him in a way that's gonna. To me, there's a like, as you said, red dash Tory, not Red Tory. And it was two different ways of looking at the world coming together in conversation. And while I understand what you're saying as far as there was two different worlds, that was, I guess, to me, the point. And that's what excited me so much.
It was politically, but not methodologically. Because if the premise was we are two researchers who have different political affiliations, who are coming together to engage in a research project, the methodology cannot be divergent. And I falsely assumed that he would be willing to learn TikTok and to engage the comments. because I believe, to bring us back to colonialism, I believe that it is immoral to be a researcher without positionality, without intersectionality, without an acknowledgement of subjectivity. Because if we believe there are no individuals, then I believe there is no objectivity. And that a researcher must disclose their positionality, must center themselves in their positionality to be an ethical researcher. And that means that our methodology must be to engage the digital culture on our own terms, with our own dignity, with our own respect. He doesn't have to agree with everybody, right? But the comments, the rabble, the commons must be the valued space, not the sage on the stage. And that fundamentally is why I had to pull the plug on Red Tory. I like Alan. I think he's a great human being. I read his Substack as well. But I'm saying this on this episode because, Russell, your comments were always fucking amazing. You are the poster child of why the comments are valuable. And, you know, that's why I'm saying you got to book a follow-up here on the podcast so we can continue our conversation. Any final thoughts before we go to the shout-outs?
I'm hoping we continue that specific thread of the conversation as well, because I'm sorry, I just love the podcast, this one as well. But part of it was, you're one type of researcher, he's another type of researcher.
Yes.
Totally different type of sees the world from a completely different lens that is just so foreign to me.
Yes.
I think the two of us, and I was learning because it's so not me. Anyway.
Yes,
let's go to the next section.
I hear
next
that,
section.
but this
sorry,
is.
I know I'm excited, but
no, but it's fair, and this is to prove my point. You and I are unique, right? Alan wants a mainstream audience. That ain't us, right? So we were not hitting that mainstream audience. We were not hitting those people. We were hitting people like you and I, and I'm broke. So I can't put labor into something that does not involve me compensating, being valued for my labor when it's the growing season. And while I ain't making money from the farm, at least I'm getting food and enjoyment and well-being. And so to your point about the flock, we're getting quite a bit of eggs. It's a shame that you live close enough to the farm, but far enough that there is no public transit between us. I'm disappointed by the constant scandal that's happening with light rapid transit in Ottawa, because I was at a time fantasizing that light rapid transit would go all the way into Lanark County. I don't think that's going to happen. But if there was a way for me to get you eggs, Russell, I would be giving you free eggs ad nauseum. I got so many fucking eggs right now. It is crazy. But look, if I ever head into Ottawa at some point soon, I will send you a message so I can get you some produce. You got any shout outs for us today?
I actually do. I chose ahead of time. Patty Crowrick. This is her first book. And
for the audio listeners, be sure to tell us which book you just held up.
Okay, so her name is Patty Crowrick, and the book is called Becoming Kin, and it's an Indigenous call to unforgetting the past and reimagining our future. So there's direct connect to the future. Amazing. So Anishinaabe and Ukrainian ancestry. Just the mixture, and she puts books in conversation with each other, and there's just the thinking is just, I find it so exciting. So definitely wanted to give her, not on Substack anymore, on Ghost, but again, amazing.
It is, to your point, it is remarkable how there are a lot of really amazing writers who have successfully graduated from Substack to Ghost, because Ghost is free and open source and does not go out of its way to host Nazis, unlike Substack. I left. I was on Substack during the pandemic. I left when I felt the conspiracists won the pandemic, and I went to Ghost. But unfortunately, I don't have the resources to maintain a Ghost site, even though I do have a couple that are currently idling. So I went back to Substack because Substack does help with discovery. But I hope that my stay on Substack is temporary. Because I would like to have a publication / network running on free and open source rather than a Substack, as imperfect as a platform it may be. Thank you, Russell. Your debut on Metaviews was spectacular. Please rebook your next episode shortly so we can get you in before the season finale, which we haven't picked a day, but we do know it's going to be in the first week of June. We did have a bunch of people say that they wanted to participate, so we are going to have enough group momentum to transcend the individual dynamic of conversations and get a very radical, provocative, fluid group conversation going on the subject of ontologies. So thanks again, Russell. Check out flora.ca, which is also currently using Substack, although I would say in a very innovative and knowledge mobilization manner. So worth checking out for the folks at home. Metaviews is also on Substack. We're on your favorite audio podcasting platform, as well as YouTube. We were on Twitch. I may go back to Twitch. The only reason I haven't been using Twitch is I'm using multi-track audio recording right now, and when I use Twitch, unfortunately, it just collapses them, and my guest is mute, which kind of defeats the purpose. But nonetheless, stay fresh, stay cool, stay dry, and we'll see you soon. Okay, thanks again. Take care.